The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Seoul District Court as Judge Kim Tae-ho settled into his leather chair. His black robes felt heavier than usual today, though he couldn't say why. The coffee from the courthouse cafeteria sat cooling on his desk, forgotten as he flipped through the stack of cases awaiting his attention. Another busy day, he muttered to himself, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. At 42, Judge Kim had been on the bench for 8 years. Long. Enough to develop what he considered an efficient rhythm. Petty crimes, traffic violations, minor disputes, they all blended together in a predictable pattern that rarely surprised him anymore. The bailiff, Officer Lim Hyun-woo, knocked twice before entering. "Your Honor, the first case is ready." Lee Norrie charged with disturbing the peace. Judge Kim nodded without looking up from his paperwork. "Send them in." The courtroom doors opened with their familiar creak, and Judge Kim finally raised his eyes to observe the defendant. Lee Norrie walked slowly to the defendant's table, her steps measured, but tired. She wore a simple navy blue sweater that had seen better days, paired with black slacks that were pressed but showed signs of frequent wear. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and Judge Kim noticed the faint shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She couldn't have been more than 30, but something in her posture suggested she carried burdens beyond her years. Her hands, Judge Kim observed, were calloused and weathered, the hands of someone who worked hard for a living. She clutched a small worn leather purse close to her side as she took her place at the defendant's table. Her attorney, Park Jin-woo, appeared equally modest. His grey suit was clean but not expensive, and his briefcase showed scratches from years of use. Judge Kim recognized the type. A public defender or perhaps a lawyer who took cases for people who couldn't afford the city's top legal talent. "Good morning, Your Honor," Park Jin-woo said with a respectful bow. His client followed suit, bowing deeply in the traditional manner. Judge Kim returned the greeting with a slight nod and opened the case file. The details were sparse, as they often were with minor infractions. Case number 2024-1847, Seoul District. Court, the defendant Lee Norrie, age 28, stands charged with disturbing the peace during a public gathering. He looked up at Norrie, who stood with her hands clasped in front of her, eyes focused somewhere just past his shoulder. "Ms. Lee, you are charged with disrupting a city council meeting last Tuesday evening. The complaint states that you refused to follow proper procedures and caused a disturbance that required security intervention. How do you plead?" Park Jin-woo leaned over to whisper something in his client's ear. Judge Kim couldn't hear the words, but he saw Norrie's slight nod of understanding. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was clear but quiet. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The prosecutor, Choi Min-ha, stood from her table with practiced confidence. She was younger than Judge Kim, probably in her early 30s, with perfectly styled hair and a designer suit that stood in stark contrast to the defendant's modest appearance. Her briefcase gleamed with newness, and her shoes clicked authoritatively against the courthouse floor. "Your Honor," Choi Min-ha began, her voice carrying the crisp tone of someone accustomed to being heard, "this is a straightforward case of public disruption. The defendant attended a city council meeting on Tuesday, March 15th, where she violated established protocols for public participation." Judge Kim half listened as the prosecutor outlined the charges. He had heard variations of this same story countless times before. Citizens who got too passionate about local issues, who forgot their place in the orderly process of civic engagement, who needed to be reminded that democracy had rules and procedures. The defendant ignored multiple warnings from council security, Choi Min-ha continued, gesturing toward a folder thick with what Judge Kim assumed were witness statements and security reports. She refused to yield the floor when her time expired and had to be physically escorted from the premises. This kind of behavior undermines the very foundation of civil discourse in our democratic institutions. Judge Kim glanced at Norrie, who remained standing silently beside her attorney. Her expression hadn't changed throughout the prosecutor's presentation, not defiant, not angry, just quietly resigned in a way that made Judge Kim feel vaguely uncomfortable, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Park Jin-woo rose to present his client's defense, but Judge Kim found his attention drifting. Through the courtroom windows, he could see the bustling streets of Seoul, where thousands of people were starting their daily routines. Traffic moved in its familiar patterns, business people hurried to meetings, and life continued its predictable flow. The defense attorney's words became background noise as Judge Kim's mind shifted to his lunch plans and the afternoon's remaining cases. This was routine work, the kind of minor infraction that required a standard response, a fine, some community service, and everyone could move on with their lives. Your Honor? Park Jin-woo's voice brought Judge Kim's attention back to the courtroom. Yes, proceed with your closing statement. The young attorney spoke passionately about his client's character and her right to participate in local government, but Judge Kim had already mentally moved on to his verdict. The law was clear, the facts seemed straightforward, and precedent dictated a predictable outcome. Fiercely, Judge Kim said in his most official courtroom voice, the same tone he had used hundreds of times before. After reviewing the evidence presented, I find you guilty of disturbing the peace. You are hereby fined 500,000 won and ordered to complete 20 hours of community service within the next 60 days. Nari's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, but she nodded her acceptance without protest. Judge Kim noticed her attorney place a gentle, supportive hand on her arm as they prepared to leave the courtroom. Court is adjourned, Judge Kim announced, already reaching for the next case file. Bailiff, please call the next matter. As the courtroom cleared and new participants filed in for the next case, Judge Kim barely registered Nari's quiet exit. She was just another face in the endless stream of minor offenders who passed through his courtroom. Another routine matter resolved efficiently and forgotten just as quickly. The small cafe on Insadong Street buzzed with the usual lunchtime crowd as Judge Kim Tae-ho stirred his third cup of coffee that day. He had been coming to this same corner table at Cafe Moonlight for nearly 5 years, finding comfort in the familiar routine of kimchi jjigae and the gentle chatter of office workers on their break. The worn wooden table bore the rings of countless coffee cups, and the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window created dancing shadows across his newspaper. Judge Kim was halfway through an article about the city's new transportation budget when a familiar voice interrupted his reading. Mind if I join you, old friend? Detective Yoon Soo-jin stood beside his table, but something was different about her usual cheerful demeanor. Her police uniform was crisp as always, but her expression carried an unusual weight that made Judge Kim look up from his paper with concern. Soo-jin, of course, sit down. You look like you've had a rough morning. Judge Kim folded his newspaper and gestured to the empty chair across from him. Want some coffee? The ajuma here makes it strong enough to wake the dead. Soo-jin settled into her chair but declined the coffee with a distracted wave. They had been friends since law school, back when she was studying criminal justice, and he was buried in constitutional law textbooks. Over the years, their paths had crossed professionally many times. She investigated cases that sometimes ended up in his courtroom. Tae-ho, I need to ask you about something, Soo-jin began, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. That woman you sentenced on Tuesday, Lee Nari, the disturbing the peace case. Judge Kim paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. What about her? Pretty straightforward case. Public disruption, standard fine. Why do you ask? Soo-jin pulled out her smartphone, its black screen reflecting the cafe's warm lighting. I was doing some background research on a completely different case, a housing dispute in Gangnam, when her name kept popping up. Tae-ho, she's not just some random troublemaker who got too loud at a city meeting. The detective's thumb moved across her phone screen, and Judge Kim could see her scrolling through what appeared to be news articles and official documents. The serious expression on her face made him set down his coffee cup entirely. Look at this, Soo-jin said, turning her phone toward him. The screen displayed a news article from the Seoul Daily, dated just 1 week ago. The headline read in bold letters, "Local activist continues fight despite court setback." Below it was a photograph that made Judge Kim's breath catch in his throat. There was Lee Nari, but not the tired, defeated woman who had stood in his courtroom. In this photo, she was standing on the steps of Seoul City Hall, speaking passionately into a microphone, while dozens of people listened intently behind her. She wore the same navy sweater he remembered, but her posture was completely different, confident, determined, alive with purpose. She's been fighting for housing rights in the Gangnam redevelopment zone for 3 years, Soo-jin continued, scrolling to show more photos. That disruption you fined her for? She was trying to speak about families being forced from their homes without proper compensation or relocation assistance. Judge Kim found himself leaning closer to the small phone screen, reading the article with growing amazement. The photos showed Nari at community meetings, sitting with elderly residents at kitchen tables covered in legal documents, organizing peaceful protests outside government buildings. In one image, she was helping an old man fill out forms while his wife brought tea on a tray decorated with faded flowers. According to this investigation, Soo-jin said, pointing to a paragraph highlighted in yellow, she's personally represented over 200 families facing displacement. And get this, she doesn't charge them anything. She works at a small accounting firm during the day and does all this advocacy work in the evenings and weekends. Judge Kim's coffee had grown cold as he continued reading. The article detailed how Nari had learned housing law by spending nights at the public library, how she had helped families navigate complex bureaucratic processes, how she had successfully delayed several evictions by finding legal technicalities that developers had overlooked. The city council meeting she disrupted, Soo-jin continued, air quotes emphasizing the word, was the final vote on demolition orders for the Gangnam district. According to witnesses, she had requested time during the public comment period, but was told the session was closed to public input. Judge Kim felt something cold settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the cafe's air conditioning. What exactly did she do that night? Soo-jin scrolled to another section of the article. She stood up during the vote and asked, "When will you hear our voices?" She was holding a petition signed by over 300 residents asking for a delay until proper relocation assistance could be arranged. Security escorted her out before she could present it. The noise of the cafe seemed to fade as Judge Kim processed this information. The clinking of dishes, the conversations at nearby tables, even the K-pop music playing softly in the background. It all became distant white noise as he stared at the photos on Soo-jin's phone. In his courtroom, Nari had seemed like just another citizen who had gotten too emotional about local politics. He had barely glanced at the case details, assuming it was the usual story of someone who couldn't control themselves in a public forum. The standard fine and community service seemed appropriate for maintaining order and teaching respect for civic procedures. But these photos told a completely different story. They showed a woman who had dedicated years of her life to helping others, who had educated herself in complex legal matters, who had become the voice for people who might otherwise go unheard. The disruption he had punished her for was an attempt to advocate for families facing homelessness. "There's more," Soo-jin said quietly, sensing her friend's growing discomfort. "I talked to some colleagues who work the Gangnam district. They say she's become something of a legend among the residents there. They call her the angel of the apartments because she appears whenever families are in trouble with eviction notices." Judge Kim pushed his untouched kimchi jjigae around his bowl, his appetite completely gone. "How did I miss all of this? The prosecutor didn't mention any of this background." "That's what worries me," Soo-jin replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I did some checking on Prosecutor Choi Min-ha. Her law firm has connections to Daehan Development Corporation, the same company behind the Gangnam redevelopment project." The implications of that statement hung in the air between them, like smoke from the cafe's kitchen. Judge Kim felt the familiar weight of his judicial robes, even though he wasn't wearing them. The responsibility he carried, the trust placed in him to make fair decisions, suddenly felt heavier than ever. "Soo-jin, are you suggesting that the prosecution was—" "I'm not suggesting anything," his friend interrupted gently. "I'm just sharing information. But Tae-ho, I think you might want to take another look at this case. Because if even half of what I've read about Lee Nari is true, then what happened in your courtroom wasn't justice. It was silencing someone who was fighting for justice." Judge Kim stared out the cafe window at the busy street beyond, watching ordinary people go about their daily lives. Somewhere out there, Lee Nari was probably back at work, still carrying the burden of a criminal conviction for trying to help her neighbors. and somewhere else families were packing their belongings, preparing to leave homes they had lived in for decades. The knot in his stomach tightened as he realized that his quick, efficient judgment might have contributed to a much larger injustice than he had ever imagined. The Seoul evening traffic moved like a slow river of red taillights as Judge Kim Tae-ho gripped his steering wheel tighter than usual. His conversation with Detective Yoon Soo-jin had left him restless and unable to concentrate on anything else. Even his favorite evening news program couldn't hold his attention as questions swirled through his mind like autumn leaves in a windstorm. By 7 o'clock, he had made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of settling into his usual evening routine of reading legal journals and preparing for tomorrow's cases, Judge Kim grabbed his car keys and headed for the door. He needed to see the Gangnam redevelopment area with his own eyes. The drive through Seoul's bustling streets gave him time to think, but not the kind of peaceful reflection he usually enjoyed. Street vendors were packing up their stalls for the night, office workers hurried toward subway stations, and the city's endless energy pulsed around him. But tonight, all of it felt different somehow, as if he was seeing his city through new eyes. When Judge Kim finally reached the Gangnam district, mentioned in the news articles, he had to pull over and park his sedan just to process what he was seeing. The neighborhood stretched before him like a ghost town from a post-apocalyptic movie. Block after block of modest apartment buildings stood empty, their windows covered with wooden boards or metal sheets. Official demolition notices were plastered across every door like yellow bandages on wounded buildings. The contrast was startling. Just a few kilometers away, gleaming skyscrapers and luxury shopping centers represented Seoul's modern face. But here, in this forgotten corner of the same district, decades of ordinary life were being systematically erased. Judge Kim stepped out of his car and walked slowly down what had once been a vibrant residential street. The silence was unnerving. No children playing in courtyards, no elderly people chatting on benches, no sounds of family dinners being prepared. Just the hollow echo of his footsteps on empty pavement and the distant hum of traffic from the main roads. But as he walked deeper into the neighborhood, Judge Kim noticed something that made him stop completely. In one building, about halfway down the block, warm yellow light glowed behind curtained windows on the 3rd and 5th floors. Someone was still living here, refusing to abandon their home despite all the pressure to leave. On the front steps of that building, an elderly man sat quietly smoking a cigarette. He wore a faded blue cardigan that had seen many winters, and his grey hair was neatly combed despite the late hour. When he noticed Judge Kim approaching, he looked up with eyes that held both wariness and curiosity. Judge Kim hesitated for a moment, uncertain how to begin the conversation. He was used to being addressed as Your Honor and speaking from behind the elevated bench of his courtroom. Here on this empty street, he was just another stranger in a suit. "Excuse me, Judge," Kim said carefully, not wanting to startle the old man. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but what's happening here? I noticed most of the buildings are empty." The elderly man studied Judge Kim's face for a long moment before gesturing to the empty space beside him on the concrete steps. "Sit down, young man. This might take a while to explain." Judge Kim accepted the invitation, noting how the old man's voice carried the weight of exhaustion, mixed with stubborn determination. "I'm Han Dong-min," the man said, offering a weathered hand for a firm handshake. "I've been living in apartment 301 for 40 years. Moved here when my wife was pregnant with our first child." As Han Dong-min spoke, Judge Kim found himself drawn into a story that was both deeply personal and achingly familiar. The old man described raising 3 children in their small apartment, watching them take their first steps in the courtyard, below teaching them to ride bicycles on these now empty streets. "My wife planted that garden over there." Han Dong-min pointed to a small patch of earth where a few determined flowers still bloomed despite the neglect. "She said even in the city, people needed something beautiful to look at. She tended those flowers until the day she died 3 years ago." Judge Kim felt something tighten in his chest as he listened. This wasn't just about buildings and development projects. These were people's lives, their memories, their connections to community and family. "The developers came 2 years ago," Han Dong-min continued, his voice growing harder. "They said our buildings were too old, not safe anymore. They promised new apartments for everyone, but the compensation they offered wouldn't even cover a deposit in the areas they suggested we move to. The old man pulled out a thick envelope from his cardigan pocket, filled with official-looking documents, covered in legal language that would intimidate most people. I can't understand half of what these papers say. The language is so complicated, like it's designed to confuse people like me. Is anyone helping you with these documents? Judge Kim asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Han Dong-min's entire demeanor changed, his tired expression brightening like a flower turning toward sunlight. There's a young woman, Lee Nari. She's like an angel sent from heaven. Every week she comes here with her big bag full of papers and her patient smile. Judge Kim's heart began beating faster, but he kept his expression neutral. What does she do? Everything, Han Dong-min said with obvious admiration. She reads through all these legal documents and explains them in words we can understand. She helps us write letters to government offices. She even organized meetings with real lawyers who speak on our behalf. The old man stood up and gestured for Judge Kim to follow him into the building. The lobby was clean but showed signs of age, with worn tile floors and fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally. Han Dong-min led him to a small community room, where folding chairs were arranged in a circle around a table covered with papers. This is where Nari holds our meetings, Han Dong-min explained. She brings tea and snacks from her own money because she knows some of us don't eat much anymore, trying to save money for moving expenses we can't afford. Judge Kim examined the papers scattered across the table. Legal briefs, government forms, petition templates, and handwritten notes in what he recognized as Nari's careful handwriting from her court appearance. The dedication evident in this organized chaos was overwhelming. She works at some office during the day, Han Dong-min continued, but she comes here almost every evening and all weekend. My neighbor, Mrs. Park So-young, says Nari helped her family delay their eviction by 6 months by finding mistakes in the developer's paperwork. Another elderly woman appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of voices. She introduced herself as the Mrs. Park that Han Dong-min had mentioned, and soon Judge Kim found himself surrounded by several residents who had emerged from their apartments to share their stories. Each tale was the same heartbreaking pattern. Families who had lived here for decades, who had built their lives in this community, now facing displacement with inadequate compensation and nowhere affordable to go. And in every story, Lee Nari appeared as the one person who had taken the time to listen, to understand, to fight for them. She doesn't ask for money, Mrs. Park So-young explained, her voice filled with gratitude. When my grandson needed school supplies, she brought them. When Mr. Cho upstairs couldn't afford his medicine, she helped him apply for assistance programs. Judge Kim spent over 2 hours listening to these stories, and with each one, the knot in his stomach grew tighter. These weren't troublemakers or people trying to cheat the system. They were ordinary citizens caught in circumstances beyond their control, and Lee Nari had become their lifeline. As he finally prepared to leave, Han Dong-min walked him back to his car. You seem like a decent person, the old man said. I hope you understand why we can't just give up and walk away. This isn't just about buildings. It's about our lives, our memories, our community. Driving home through the now quiet Seoul streets, Judge Kim's mind raced with everything he had learned. The woman he had dismissed as a public nuisance was actually a community hero. The disruption he had punished was an act of desperation by someone fighting for people who had no other voice. By the time he reached his apartment, Judge Kim knew that his quick, efficient judgment had been not just wrong, but potentially devastating to the very cause of justice he had sworn to uphold. The weight of that realization would keep him awake most of the night, staring at his ceiling and wondering how many other cases he had mishandled in his rush to maintain order and efficiency. Judge Kim Tae-ho arrived at his chambers that Thursday morning earlier than he had in months. The courthouse was still quiet, with only the security guards and cleaning staff moving through the marble corridors. His sleepless night had left him with dark circles under his eyes, but his mind was sharper and more focused than it had been in years. The morning sunlight streaming through his office windows illuminated stacks of legal books and case files that suddenly seemed less important than they had just days ago. Judge Kim sat heavily in his leather chair and reached for his phone dialing the extension for his clerk. "I'm So Young, I need you in my chambers immediately, and bring your notepad." Within minutes, his clerk appeared at the door. So Young was the efficient woman in her early 30s who had worked for Judge Kim for 3 years. She prided herself on maintaining perfect organization and anticipating his needs before he even voiced them. This morning, however, she noticed something different in his demeanor that made her extra alert. "I need you to pull every document related to the Lee Nari case from Tuesday," Judge Kim said without his usual morning pleasantries. "Not just the basic file, but everything. Court transcripts, police reports, witness statements, prosecution notes. I want the complete record of what happened at that city council meeting." So Young's pen moved quickly across her notepad, but she couldn't hide her surprise. In her 3 years working for Judge Kim, he had never requested a full case review after rendering judgment. "Your Honor, is there a specific concern about the case?" "Just get me everything, So Young, and I need it within the hour." While waiting for the documents, Judge Kim found himself unable to concentrate on his other cases. The faces of Han Dong-min and the other residents kept appearing in his mind, their stories echoing in the quiet of his chambers. He walked to his window and looked out at the city beyond, wondering how many other Lee Naris were out there, fighting battles he knew nothing about. When So Young returned with a thick folder and several transcript binders, Judge Kim cleared his entire desk to make space. For the first time since law school, he felt the need to examine every detail of a case with the intensity of a detective investigating a crime. The first document that caught his attention was the complete transcript of the city council meeting. As he read through the official record, a picture emerged that was completely different from the brief summary he had been given in court. The meeting had been contentious from the start. City council members had discussed the Gangnam redevelopment project for over 2 hours, with several heated exchanges about timelines and compensation packages. When they reached the section for public comments, the council chairman had announced that due to time constraints, the public comment period would be limited to pre-registered speakers only. According to the transcript, Lee Nari had approached the microphone and identified herself as a representative of the Gangnam Residents Association. She had politely requested permission to speak, explaining that she had a petition signed by over 300 residents who would be affected by the demolition orders being voted on that evening. "Madam Chairman," the transcript recorded Nari saying, "these families have been waiting months for an opportunity to present their concerns. Many of them are elderly and couldn't attend tonight's meeting. I'm here to speak for those who have no other voice." The chairman's response was curt. "Ms. Lee, you were not pre-registered to speak. Please return to your seat, or you will be removed." From the chambers, Judge Kim read the next section twice, feeling his chest tighten with each word. Nari had tried to explain that she had attempted to register, but was told the list was full. She had asked if she could at least submit the petition for the record, even if she couldn't speak. That's when security had been called. The transcript recorded her final words before being escorted out. "When will you hear our voices? These are your constituents, your neighbors. They deserve to be heard before you vote on their futures." Judge Kim set down the transcript and rubbed his temples. The disruption he had punished consisted of a polite request to participate in the democratic process and a desperate question about when citizens would be allowed to speak to their elected representatives. His attention turned to the prosecution files, and what he found there made his blood run cold. Prosecutor Choi Min-ha's notes were unusually detailed for such a minor case. She had requested the maximum penalty allowed by law and had prepared arguments that seemed disproportionate to the alleged offense. More disturbing was a memo attached to the file that had somehow been included by mistake. It was marked internal communication only and contained a brief note from Choi Min-ha's law firm about neutralizing activist interference in the Gangnam. Project Judge Kim reached for his phone and began making calls. His first was to Judge Lee Won-soo, an old friend who specialized in ethics violations. After explaining the situation, Judge Lee confirmed what Judge Kim already suspected. Prosecutor, Choi Min-ha's law firm, Daehan Legal Associates, had significant financial ties to Daehan Development Corporation. "Tae-ho, this sounds like a serious conflict of interest," Judge Lee said over the phone. If the prosecutor had financial incentives to secure convictions against housing activists, that's grounds for prosecutorial misconduct. His second call was to the Seoul Bar Association's ethics hotline. The attorney who answered listened carefully to Judge Kim's concerns and promised to open an investigation into the prosecution's handling of the case. By noon, Judge Kim had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for Park Jin-woo, Nari's public defender. "Mr. Park, this is Judge Kim Tae-ho. I need to speak with you about the Lee Nari case." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Your Honor, I'm not sure I understand. The case was concluded on Tuesday. I want to schedule a hearing to review my judgment in that case, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Can your client be available?" Park Jin-woo's surprise was evident in his voice. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the case was already decided. Are you saying you want to reopen it?" Judge Kim took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would set unprecedented events in motion. "Mr. Park, I'm saying that I believe I may have made a serious error in judgment. After reviewing additional evidence and circumstances that weren't properly presented during the original hearing, I have concerns about the fairness of the proceedings." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Park Jin-woo finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Your Honor, are you certain about this? This is highly unusual." "I'm aware of how unusual this is, Mr. Park. I'm also aware that justice sometimes requires unusual measures." "Will your client be available tomorrow morning?" "Yes, Your Honor, she'll be there." After hanging up, Judge Kim sat in his chambers as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk. He knew that what he was about to do would raise eyebrows throughout the judicial system. Judges rarely reopened their own cases, and never. For minor infractions like disturbing the peace. But as he looked at the thick file of documents spread across his desk, Judge Kim realized that this had never been a minor case at all. It was about fundamental questions of justice, fairness, and whether the legal system served all citizens equally, or just those with the most power and influence. That evening, as he prepared to leave his chambers, Judge Kim called Im So-young one final time. "So-young, I need you to prepare the courtroom for a special hearing tomorrow morning. And please contact the court reporter. I want every word of this hearing on the official record." As he drove home through Seoul's evening traffic, Judge Kim felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the nervous excitement of knowing that tomorrow would bring either his greatest professional triumph or his most spectacular failure. Either way, he was finally ready to face the consequences of his decisions. The Friday morning sun cast long shadows across the Seoul District Courthouse as an unusual gathering began to form. Word had somehow spread through the legal community that Judge Kim Tae-ho was reopening a case he had already decided, something so rare that several attorneys had arrived early just to witness the proceedings. Lee Nari walked through the courthouse, doors with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. She had barely slept after receiving the call from her attorney, Park Jin-woo, who had struggled to explain why she needed to return to court. The same navy sweater she had worn earlier that week now felt different on her shoulders, as if the weight of uncertainty had been replaced by something she couldn't quite identify. Park Jin-woo met her in the hallway outside the courtroom, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of nervous energy. "Hanari, I've been practicing law for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Judge Kim specifically requested this hearing to review his own decision. Inside the courtroom, Judge Kim sat at his bench reviewing his notes one final time. He had spent the entire night studying housing rights legislation, public participation laws, and judicial procedures for case reviews. His desk was covered with legal texts, precedent cases, and the thick file containing everything related to Nari's situation. The bailiff, Officer Lim Hyun-woo, called the court to order as the small gathering of observers settled into their seats. Among them sat Detective Yoon Soo-jin, who had taken personal leave to witness her friend's unprecedented decision. Several journalists had also appeared, drawn by rumors of the unusual hearing. "Court is now in session," Officer Lim announced. "The Honorable Judge Kim Tae-ho presiding." Judge Kim rose from his chair, and for the first time in his judicial career, He felt the full weight of the black robes he wore. They no longer felt like mere ceremonial clothing, but like a symbol of the responsibility he carried to ensure justice for every person who stood before his bench. "Ms. Lee," Judge Kim began, his voice carrying a gravity and sincerity that hadn't been present during their first encounter, "I have called this hearing to address serious concerns about the fairness and thoroughness of your original trial." Nari stood beside her attorney, her hands clasped in front of her, but this time her posture was different. The resignation and defeat that had marked her previous appearance had been replaced by quiet dignity and cautious hope. "After conducting an extensive review of your case," Judge Kim continued, "including examination of the complete City Council, meeting transcript, witness statements, and additional evidence that was not properly considered during your original hearing, I have reached several conclusions." The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of traffic from the street outside seemed amplified. Judge Kim opened the thick folder before him and began reading carefully prepared remarks. First, the transcript of the City Council meeting reveals that your actions did not constitute disturbing the peace as defined by Seoul Municipal Code. You requested permission to speak during a designated public comment period, which is your right as a citizen. When denied that opportunity, you asked a single question about democratic participation before voluntarily leaving with security. Nari's eyes widened in shock, and she felt Park Jin-woo's steadying hand on her arm. "Second," Judge Kim continued, "I have discovered that proper procedures for public participation were not followed during that council meeting. Citizens have a legal right to present petitions to their elected representatives, and the denial of that right appears to have violated established municipal guidelines." Judge Kim paused and looked directly at Nari, making eye contact in a way he hadn't done during their first encounter. "Third, and most importantly, I failed in my duty as a judge to thoroughly examine the circumstances and context surrounding your case. I allowed expediency to override justice, and for that failure, I owe you a sincere apology." The courtroom stirred with whispered conversations as observers processed the unprecedented nature of a judge apologizing to a defendant from the bench. "Therefore," Judge Kim said, his voice growing stronger, "I am hereby vacating your conviction for disturbing the peace. Your fine of 500,000 won is dismissed, and your community service requirement is cancelled. Furthermore, I am ordering an official investigation into the City Council's procedures during the meeting in question, as there appear to have been violations of public comment regulations that may have affected other citizens as well." Nari felt tears forming in her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. For months, she had carried the burden of a criminal conviction while trying to help families facing displacement. Now that burden was being lifted by the same person who had imposed it. Judge Kim wasn't finished. "Additionally, I am referring this case to the Seoul Bar Association for investigation of potential prosecutorial misconduct. Evidence suggests that conflicts of interest may have influenced the original prosecution of your case." When court was adjourned, something unprecedented happened. Instead of retreating immediately to his chambers, Judge Kim stepped down from his bench and approached Nari directly. The formal barrier between judge and defendant dissolved as two human beings faced each other on equal ground. "Ms. Lee," Judge Kim said quietly, "I understand that you've dedicated yourself to fighting for families facing displacement. I want you to know that if there are legal procedural issues with the redevelopment process, the courts should be a place where citizens can seek fair hearings. I failed to provide that for you initially, but I hope this demonstrates that our judicial system can correct its mistakes." Nari, still processing everything that had happened, looked up at the judge who had just transformed her life. "Your Honor, thank you for listening, really listening. Sometimes that's all we need. Someone with power who is willing to truly hear what ordinary people are trying to say." Her words hit Judge Kim with unexpected force. In his years on the bench, he had focused on efficiency, on moving cases through the system, on maintaining order. But he had forgotten that each case represented a human story, a life that could be changed by his decisions. Outside the courthouse, news reporters gathered around Nari and her attorney. the story of a judge reopening his own case to correct an injustice would make headlines across Seoul, but more importantly, it would send a message to other citizens that the legal system could be responsive to their needs. 6 months later, the investigation Judge Kim had ordered revealed multiple procedural violations in the Gangnam redevelopment process. The hasty demolition schedule was temporarily halted, and the city was required to establish a proper relocation assistance program with fair compensation for displaced families. Han Dong-min and the other residents were able to remain in their homes for an additional year while negotiations continued, and many eventually received compensation packages that allowed them to relocate to suitable housing within their means. Judge Kim continued serving on the bench, but his approach to every case changed fundamentally. He began reading complete case files, considering the human context behind legal charges, and ensuring that every defendant received the careful attention their situation deserved. Lee Na-ri continued her advocacy work, but now she did so without the burden of a criminal record. Her story became an inspiration to other community activists, proving that even in the face of powerful interests and institutional obstacles, persistent voices for justice could eventually be heard. The courthouse, where it all began, continued its daily business of processing cases and rendering judgments. But in one small corner of Seoul's vast legal system, something important had changed. A judge had remembered that justice isn't just about applying laws, it's about understanding the human stories behind each case and ensuring that every person, regardless of their power or status, receives fair treatment under the law. Years later, when Judge Kim trained new judges, he would tell them about Lee Na-ri's case, not as a legal precedent, but as a reminder that their greatest responsibility wasn't efficiency or order. It was ensuring that justice served all people equally, especially those whose voices might otherwise go unheard. The end.